Do you guys remember the two girls who recorded their murder before their bodies were found near a wooded area?
Trying to identify the suspect in this photo and this voice.
On February 2017, 13-year-old Abby Williams and 14-year-old Liberty German were walking along Delphi Historic Trails, Indiana, when they snapped these photos right before they went missing that evening. Police suspected that the man in this photo was involved in their disappearance and murder, but they didn't know who this man was. The girls' bodies were found the next day very close to where they took those photos, and police received multiple tips that the man in the recording and photo on Liberty's phone was 50-year-old Richard Allen. Richard was arrested and charged, but he pleaded not guilty and kept his innocence. But recently, on April 3rd of this year, Richard called his wife Kathy and confessed to murdering both Abby and Liberty. Investigators believe that Richard forced the girls down a hill and took their life with a .40 caliber.
This is maybe the scariest urban legend I've ever heard, and it ended up being true. Back in the 1970s, there was this terrifying fun house in Long Beach, California called The Laugh in the Dark. And there was always this urban legend that all the mannequins inside were fake, except for one. Also, mind you, this is what this week's episode is about, so if you don't want spoilers, just listen to the episode. This urban legend came to be because there was one mannequin inside that just looked wrong. All of the other ones looked fake, but this one in particular looked way too human. And a bunch of the kids also said the area that the mannequin was in just smelled really, really bad. So a few years go by, and one day a film crew comes in and is using Laugh in the Dark for a film set. The director's lining up a shot, and he just doesn't like the way this one mannequin looks in frame. So he goes over to a crew member and he's like, hey, can you just move this out of the shot? So the crew member goes over and starts moving the mannequin when its arm pops off. And inside of the mannequin's arm is human bone. The kids had been totally right. The mannequin was a mummified body. There's so much more to this story, like who the person was and how they got there, and I talk about the whole thing this week on the episode.
This bank worker murdered her customers after stealing money from their family. On July 2018, 52-year-old Cynthia and her son, 22-year-old Sean, were found murdered in their apartment in Florida. The investigation quickly pointed at 25-year-old Amelia Bissoon, who worked at Chase Bank in downtown Orlando. Cynthia's 65-year-old father, who suffered from dementia, was a regular at Chase Bank, and he usually dealt with Amelia. Amelia was the one who helped the man with his banking needs. And on March of that year, Amelia wrote a $50,000 check from the elderly man's account, which was supposed to go to his grandson's account, Sean. But instead, Amelia and her husband, 28-year-old Joshua, took this money and put it in their account. A few months later, Cynthia went to the bank with her son Sean and asked why these checks were not deposited into his account after her father said that the funds should be there. Before the family could investigate, Joshua went to Cynthia's home and took her life and her son's life. At first, they denied having anything to do with the murders, but after some time, Amelia turned on her husband and he was sentenced to life in prison. On the other hand, Amelia was only charged with theft and she got 3 years in jail.
I killed my son for the worst reason ever. You won't believe what led to this shocking act. Stay till the end only if you're ready for a surprise. My name's John Shively, and I'm here to tell my story. Living in Madison, Wisconsin, I'm a 65-year-old man. I've got a son, Zachary, who's 25, and we usually have a good relationship. But on July 22nd this year, things took a turn. It was just another warm Saturday. As I sat on my porch, the comforting Wisconsin air surrounded me, and I enjoyed the nature. Financially, I was facing some challenges, taking it one day at a time. I'd fallen behind on my taxes and missed a few mortgage payments. On that day, my son Zachary came to me asking for money. He mentioned he needed $2.50. We had a bit of a back and forth since he frequently asked for money, but in the end, I handed him $2. He already had 25 cents, but was still a quarter short for his intended purchase. I was surprised he asked for more right after I'd given him some. Our conversation grew tense. In a sudden move, he pushed me. Reacting, I drew my gun and shot him. Filled with immediate regret, I called the police. When they arrived, it was too late for my boy. I'm now facing an intentional homicide charge with a bond of $300,000. Keep following for more on my story.
There's been a huge breakthrough in a hideous unsolved murder case. Virginia woman Robin Lawrence was 37 years old. She was tragically found stabbed to death in her home in Springfield on the 20th of November 94. Her husband had actually been out of town at the time of the killing and had been concerned when he couldn't get hold of his wife. He asked a friend to check in on her, and what the friend found was sickening. Not only was Robin deceased inside the property, but her 2-year-old daughter had been there the whole time. She was by this point severely dehydrated, having been left alone with nothing but her mum's body for days. Police were able to collect DNA from the crime scene, but unfortunately when they ran it through their systems, they didn't get a match. However, we now have a massive breakthrough. It's obviously been decades since the horrific murder, but now a man may be finally brought to justice. Due to advancements in DNA technology, a familial DNA match was found. Police then discovered that Stefan Smirk, aged 51, was working in the area of the murder at the time. Police worked with a DNA technology company to create a composite image and compared it to photos of what Stefan looked like at the time. Upon arresting him, police claim that they got a confession. He's now been charged with second-degree murder.
3 people were arrested last night for the murder of Sarah Sharif. 10-year-old Sarah was found dead at her home in Surrey on the 10th of August after police received a call from her father, who had fled to Pakistan just the day before. Sarah had multiple extensive injuries, which were likely to have been sustained over an extended period of time, but her cause of death has not been released. It was soon discovered after Sarah's body was found that her father, her stepmother, her uncle and 5 children had all fled the UK and were in hiding in Pakistan. Sarah had been living with her father, Irfan Sharif, since 2019 when he gained custody of her and her older brother, and it wasn't long before he stopped contact between the children and their mother, Olga. Olga stated that she hadn't seen her children in around 4 years, and heartbreakingly she was the one that went to identify Sarah's body. She said she barely recognised her, and her face was swollen and bruised. A huge manhunt was launched and missing persons reports were issued for all 5 children, and they were found last week at Irfan Sharif's father's house. They've since been taken into protective custody. Irfan and his wife Binash released a video last week to say that Sarah's death was an accident and that their family were now fearing for their lives, and that's why they were in hiding. They were all apprehended at Gatwick Airport last night when their flight arrived from Dubai to the UK, and they've said that they want to put their version of events across to police. They've all been arrested on suspicion of murder.
Hi everybody, it's Mr. Anime here. I'm going to reward myself with probably a 2 or 3 week break. Thanks for watching my channel.
You won't believe what this YouTuber did. This is Trey Sessler, better known as Mr. Anime on YouTube. So back in the early days of YouTube, in the mid-2000s, Trey was a huge personality on the platform. Trey has actually been credited in the past for helping kickstart the anime community on YouTube. These were the days when YouTube was just starting to attract an audience, and Trey took that opportunity and ran with it and amassed hundreds of thousands of subscribers. In his videos, he would review anime, he would review video games, and he seemed like just a very normal guy creating innocent videos. But at some point along the way, people started to notice that his mask was slipping. He started to make videos with a lot of weapons in them. As you can see, I've had to blur them out in this photo. And he also posted images and talked about how he had killed animals. He used real weapons in some of his videos, and he even went to random buildings and shot at them in the middle of the night. But in 2012, Trey's life would take a very dark turn. So in February of that year, he posted on his channel that he was taking a break from YouTube. That's a video I showed at the beginning of this TikTok. Then on March 13th, 2012, he came back and said he had found a new job which was going to prevent him from posting on YouTube in the future. In reality though, his plans for the future were much darker. On March 20th, 2012, Trey decided he was going to kill people. And he started out with his family. On that day, he went to his family's home, he lured his mom out into the garage, and he shot her point blank in the chest, killing her. He then entered the house and shot his brother in the head, which killed him instantly. Trey's father, hearing the shots, then woke up and walked over to investigate, and Trey shot him in the chest just like he did his mom. Afterwards, he went through the house, killed the family's pets, and destroyed the home. And to end this horrible plan, he took ammunition and weapons and started walking towards the high school at the end of the street. Trey would later claim that he wanted to kill at least 70 students so that he could become the deadliest mass killer in United States history. He said he had killed his family because he didn't want them to see what he was about to do next, and that he was inspired by the Columbine killers, amongst other serial killers and mass murderers. However, though, right before he was about to commit this shooting at the school, Trey backed down. He was quickly arrested afterwards, and that's when he admitted to all these terrible things he had done. This is a shocking story, and it's just crazy that his account was on YouTube until 2020, 8 years after the shootings, when he finally was taken down. After the shootings, it was discovered that Trey had written a lot of stuff all over the doors, and people could see that he had been disturbed, obviously, for a very long time. This just goes to show that even someone as innocent looking as Mr. Anime, you have no idea what they're really capable of.
This true crime case will make your blood boil. Over a decade ago, 19-year-old Kara Nichols vanished. The teenager was born and raised in Colorado Springs and unfortunately had begun using substances throughout high school. She was reported missing on the 14th of October 2012. At this point, her roommates hadn't heard from her for 5 days. Police soon learned that she'd actually spoken to her brother on the phone on the 9th of October at around 11:45 p.m. She told him that she was on her way to a modelling shoot. The next day, unsettlingly, her phone was going straight to answer phone. It was actually her brother that ended up travelling to her apartment to figure out what was going on. He spoke to her roommates and the alarm was raised. Now, Kara's laptop was actually still at her apartment, which was concerning because if she just decided to up and left, she wouldn't have left her laptop behind. When investigators started digging into the case, they found that Kara had been placing ads as an S-worker. Interestingly, she'd actually posted an ad with her phone number on it the same day she went missing. Police also found out that her phone had been used on that day too at almost midnight. Investigators started looking into exactly which numbers she'd received calls from and set about contacting the individuals. They got a return call of Joel Hollendorfer. He admitted to police that yes, he had spoke to the girl about S services, but they'd never ended up meeting. However, when police tracked Kara's phone, her last activity was in the area of Joel's parents' house. Police ended up searching at the property with a cadaver dog. Disturbingly, the dog barked in loads of different areas on the property to indicate remains. However, the owner of the property stated that this must be just because they have a lot of animals and over the years the animals die and then they bury them in the back garden. The police were happy with this explanation and gave up on the search. They also, though, decided to interview Joel's wife, who strangely declined to cooperate with the investigation. Frustratingly, Kara's case went cold. On February the 8th, 2022, a decade after she went missing, police confirmed that they had found Kara's body. It was on that property they'd searched the whole time. Joel was obviously arrested. In February 2022, his wife decided to come clean to police. She told them that Joel had told her in 2014 that he accidentally killed an escort that he'd hired. He admitted that he accidentally strangled her to death and buried her near a dead horse on the property. Joel's defense in court claimed that he accidentally killed her in an S-act gone wrong and that she lost consciousness due to substance use. Shockingly, he was only convicted of manslaughter and got just 24 years in prison. This was a huge blow to Kara's family.
This TikToker named Mehek Bukhari and her mother Anne Serene were recently given life sentences in prison for murder. So at the time of her arrest, Mehek had gained over 130 followers here on TikTok and on Instagram, and she posted pretty basic stuff like beauty advice, fashion advice, videos with her mom, and no one could have ever seen this coming. It's also interesting to note that Mehek's Instagram page is actually still online. You can see that she has almost 40,000 followers on there. All of her comments are turned off, but these links will show you all the TikToks that she posted on this platform. So Mehek's mother, Anne Serene, became enamored with her daughter's glamorous lifestyle and decided she wanted to join in too. That's why she decided to appear in TikTok videos, go to bar openings and events with her daughter, and she made her presence known on the platform. Now, at some point along the way, Mehek's mother, Anne Serene, pictured here, who was 41 at the time of the murders, got herself a boyfriend, even though she had been happily married for years. And at one point during this affair, Anne Serene's boyfriend decided that he wanted to expose the affair and the infidelity. And he threatened to tell Mehek and Anne Serene's family members and friends that they had been seeing each other, and he allegedly also planned on releasing explicit photographs that he had of Anne Serene. So at this point, Mehek came up with a plan. They talked for a while, came up with a plan, and eventually Mehek sent her mom a cryptic message on WhatsApp. She wrote her mom, "I'll soon get him jumped by guys, and he won't know what day it is." So on February 11th, 2022, Saqib, who was Ansreen's lover, and his friend Hashim decided to meet the mother and daughter in a parking lot. Ansreen had told Saqib that she would pay him off so that he wouldn't release any of the videos or photos that he had of her, and basically said she'd give him $3,000 or so to keep quiet about the affair. But that's not what happened. So at the grocery store, they were confronted by a group of people dressed in balaclavas, and they took off in their car. This ended in a high-speed chase, and these people in the balaclavas eventually forced these two off of the road where they crashed. They were going over 90 miles per hour, and both of them died. So obviously there was a lot of evidence that connected Mehek and her mother to these crimes. They eventually arrested all of the people involved in this scheme. But basically, at the end of the day, Mehek and her mother, Ansreen, were the ones that got this crime pinned on them because they masterminded the entire thing. There's so much more to this story. This is basically an abbreviated version of what exactly happened. But at the end of the day, both the mother and daughter received a sentence of life in prison, with Mehek being required to serve at least 31 years as a minimum, and her mother, Ansreen, required to serve about 26 years. This is a crazy story.
Many of us are very familiar with this photo. I was just 13 years old at the time when it was splashed all over the news, and I can just remember hoping and praying that these two 10-year-old girls would be found safe and well. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. If you're not familiar with this story, this is Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, and they were the victims of a double child murder back in 2002 in Soham, Cambridgeshire. On Sunday, August 4th, 2002, Jessica left her house telling her parents that she was going round to Holly's as they were having a barbecue. She also had a necklace that she'd recently bought for her that she wanted to give to her. Little did they know when they said goodbye to their daughter that day, that was the last time that they'd see Jessica alive. Jessica arrived at Holly's house and they went upstairs to play video games and listen to music. They came down to eat some food and Holly's mum took this picture of them before they headed back upstairs. Around 6:15 that evening, the girls left the house without telling anyone and they went to a nearby leisure centre to get sweets from a vending machine. Around 8 p.m, Holly's mum went upstairs to tell the girls to come downstairs and say goodbye to their guests, but Holly's room was empty. Nicola and her husband Kevin searched the house and then went out onto the street to look for the girls, but they were nowhere to be seen. They then called Jessica's parents to see if the girls had turned up there, but they were also worried as it was just past Jessica's curfew and she hadn't returned home. Just before 10 p.m, and after frantic efforts from both families to locate the girls, they were both reported missing. Tragically, Holly and Jessica were already dead by this point. An intensive search began immediately. 400 officers were assigned full-time to search for the girls. Hundreds of locals also joined in with the search, and the police were doing door-to-door inquiries. One of the locals that was heavily involved in the search was this man, Ian Huntley. He was a caretaker in the area and his girlfriend also worked at the girls' school and had just applied for a full-time teaching assistant job there. Ian actually told police that he'd seen the girls on the day that they disappeared, and he said the same thing in a TV interview.
Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just said, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
Maxine told police that she'd been in the bath at the time and had heard Ian talking to the girls before he came back inside the house. In actual fact, Maxine wasn't even in Soham at the time that the girls disappeared. She was in Grimsby visiting her mother, but she was covering for Ian. Maxine also did a TV interview and she kept referring to the girls in the past tense, saying things like, they were really lovely. And she then made a direct appeal to the children to come home. The police were immediately suspicious of the couple's story, and after searching the house they noted that most of the rooms seemed to have been recently cleaned. There was also washing hanging on the line outside, despite the fact that it had been raining. It wasn't long before Ian's appearance started to change. He was losing weight and he was actually showing signs of paranoia, even saying to one officer, "You think I did it, I was the last one to see them alive." They became even more suspicious of Ian when he started asking police how the investigation was going. He even went as far as asking them how long DNA evidence could survive before deteriorating. This prompted them to search his house one more time, as well as Soane Village College where he worked, and they made a discovery that would lead to his arrest. They found a metal bin in the grounds that contained the charred remains of 2 Manchester United shirts. Fibres from the shirts were a precise match to those found on Ian's clothing and in his house, and his fingerprints were also found on the bin. They also searched Ian's car and found that just like the house, it had been recently cleaned. The lining of the boot had also been removed and replaced with carpet. On August 17th at 4:30 a.m, Ian and Maxine were both arrested, and just 8 hours later, the girls' bodies were discovered. They were found by gamekeeper Keith Pryor, who had noticed an unpleasant smell near an irrigation ditch in Suffolk. They were laid side by side in the 5-foot ditch, and due to the amount of time that they'd been in there, they were in an advanced state of decomposition. The coroner stated that whoever murdered the girls had moved their bodies to this location and had also tried to burn them. A definite cause of death couldn't be determined, but the coroner did state that they most likely died from asphyxiation. Ian refused to answer questions in his police interviews, and he tried to fake mental illness. The police had no choice but to refer him for a psychological examination. Maxine was charged with perverting the course of justice and assisting an offender after she admitted to helping Ian concoct a story after he told her that the girls had actually been inside their house while she was away. According to Maxine, Ian had told her that the girls had come by the house because Holly had a nosebleed, and that he'd let them inside to try and help, and that he was afraid that he'd be accused of murder if they were found dead. She pleaded not guilty to both charges. On October 8th, Ian was declared mentally competent to stand trial, and he also pleaded not guilty to his charge of double murder. Eventually, the trial began in November 2003, and Ian gave his version of events. He claimed that the girls came by the house and Holly had a nosebleed, so he invited them both inside and took them to the bathroom. He said that the bath was full of water because he'd just washed his dog, and somehow he managed to knock Holly into the bath and she hit her head. He then said that Jessica started screaming, so in order to shut her up, he put his hand over her nose and mouth, and he accidentally suffocated her. He said when he turned back around to Holly in the bath, she too was dead. The jury deliberated for 4 days before coming back with their verdict. They accepted that Maxine only lied to police to protect her boyfriend, and that prior to their arrest, she believed his claims of innocence. She was found not guilty of assisting an offender and given 3.5 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. Ian Huntley was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 40 years, meaning he can apply for parole in 2042 when he's 68 years old. The only reason he wasn't given a whole life tariff was because the passing of the Criminal Justice Act 2003 was the day after his conviction. Maxine Carr was released from prison on May 14, 2004, and she was given a new identity for her own protection. Ian Huntley is currently incarcerated at HMP Frankland in Durham. He's had many failed suicide attempts and has also been attacked by other prisoners countless times, including having boiling water poured over him at HMP Wakefield and having his throat slashed at HMP Frankland. Holly and Jessica's funerals took place just a day apart, and they were buried side by side.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
Did you know that this movie was allegedly inspired by a disturbing true crime case? The Wu family in Kaohsiung, Taiwan believed they were possessed by religious deities. There are very few sources that are translated into English, so I'm not sure of the full details of the story. But allegedly in 2005, the family believed they were cursed and began accusing each other of being possessed by various demons. To get rid of these demons, they stopped eating, began beating each other, burned their skin with incense, and force-fed each other feces. And within a month, their 28-year-old daughter died from exhaustion depression and multiple organ failure. The family was convinced that it wasn't their daughter who was dying, but the demon who possessed her, so they didn't get her medical help. They were all sent for psychiatric evaluation and diagnosed with shared delusional disorder and hysteria. And the remaining 5 members of the family were indicted on reckless endangerment. If you guys saw this movie, let me know what you thought.
One of the most successful serial killers in history is never talked about. Let's talk about Giulia Tofana, who was said to have killed around 600 men. That is a lot of men. There is little known about Giulia's life and upbringing. No pictures, nothing. This story takes place in the Renaissance period in Italy. Back then, women didn't really have any rights. Like, at all. They were usually forced into arranged, loveless marriages. In this time, when you got married, your husband owned you. Men had full ownership and control over their wives. Husbands would often beat their wives without any consequence. And unfortunately for the women, divorce was basically non-existent at the time. It wasn't even an option. So safe to say there was a lot of women stuck in abusive and loveless marriages with no way out. That's until Giulia started her little business. Giulia created an odorless, tasteless, and colorless, undetectable poison, and she put it in makeup products. She disguised her poison in beauty products that women could easily keep on their vanity and no one would question it. She called it Aqua Tofana. Pretty cool name. This product would allow women to discreetly kill their husbands over the span of 4 days. A few drops every day, and the initial symptoms would simply seem like a flu. A few more drops the next few days, and it would slowly weaken and eventually kill the men. You're probably wondering how she got away with killing all of these men without anybody noticing. Well, Giulia was very careful. She didn't just sell Aqua Tofana to anyone. Any new client had to be verified by a past client and have a background check. Giulia's clients were actually really protective over her as well and kept her secret. This went on for over 20 years. Giulia would also coach the women on how to act around the days of the poison. After the first day, when the husband starts getting the flu symptoms, to act really concerned and call a doctor. The doctor would come and assume it was just a basic illness, give them medication, and leave. The key was that the women were the ones to call the doctor. They had to act concerned, anxious. When the husbands would eventually die, the doctors would be baffled. And the key to all this was that the women were told to demand an autopsy. But the thing about Aqua Tofana is that it was undetectable in an autopsy, meaning that all of these deaths came back as natural causes. Unfortunately, the story is too long for one video, so come back for part 2 to see what happens next.
Let's talk about what happened with the Watts family. This is 37-year-old Christopher Lee Watts, and this is 34-year-old Shannon Catherine Watts. At the time, they were living in Colorado, and they also had 2 daughters. One of them was named Cece and Bella. Also at the time, Shannon was pregnant with a boy. On Monday, August 13th of 2018, around 1:48 a.m., Shannon was returning from a work trip to Arizona, and her friend/colleague was actually going to give her a ride back home. Since Shannon was gone for the weekend, Chris took care of the girls. Shannon and her daughters were reported missing by the friend/colleague because Shannon had missed her OBGYN appointment and she wasn't returning any of her friends' text messages. Once Shannon had missed a business meeting, her friend/colleague had went to her house around 12:10 p.m. and she was just knocking on the door, and eventually there was no answer, so that is when she calls Shannon's husband Chris and lets him know, but he's at work at the time, and she is also contacting the police as well. Around 1:40 p.m., the police department heads over to the Watts house, and they are going to do a welfare check. And Chris, he lets them go in the house and check anything that they want. They notice that Shannon's purse with her keys are there, as well as the children's medication. Her phone was later located in between the couch cushions. Also, Shannon's car was still in the garage with the car seats of the children. Chris was doing interviews with local news stations, just pleading for his wife and children to come home. On August 15th of 2018, Chris Watts was arrested. According to a security camera in the interview room, Chris had failed the polygraph test and he subsequently had confessed to killing his wife. Chris had stated that he was having an affair and he wanted to separate from his wife, and his wife was not taking it well at all, and that's when she decided to strangle the kids. So then he decided to strangle his wife. Chris then takes the bodies to a remote oil storage site, which was leased by his employer. His daughter's bodies were found in a crude oil storage tanks. Shannon was buried in a shallow grave nearby. On August 21st, Chris was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. On November 6th, Chris had pleaded guilty, but Shannon's family did not want him to get the death sentence. On November 19th, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences. On September 30th of 2020, Netflix actually came out with a documentary regarding this whole family case. There is probably more information than what I am giving you, so I would recommend go see it. If it's still on there, I'm not sure if it's on there since it came out in 2020, but it might be. So I would definitely go check that out so you can get some more information.